Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Abhijit Bhaduri, and I work as an advisor to organizations on their talent strategies. And today I'm going to ask you a real interesting question. What does a digital anthropologist do? Well, if I were to really start thinking about their work, I would think of two kinds of work. One is they really work like detectives. They would try and figure out how do people actually use the technology rather than what the people thought they would use it for. Let me give you an example. You might say medical applications, the apps which are there, they provide medical advice. You might suddenly discover that in many of these markets, these are not being used. The reason could not be that the app is badly designed. It's just that people believe that medical advice, which does not come from an in-person examination with the doctor, is not to be trusted. Now, this is a question of trust which comes up so often, and those are the kind of problems that digital anthropologists actually work on. Isn't that interesting? So, today I'm delighted to bring to you somebody who's a digital anthropologist, and I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Payal Arora, who is a professor of inclusive artificial intelligence cultures at Utrecht University. Thank you so much for being here, Payal. What a delight. I loved your TED Talk, and I've loved your two books, which is The Next Billion Users, and of course, Pessimism to Promise. And I'm going to talk to you all about it today. There's so much to talk about. I found both the books truly counterintuitive. Loved it. So thank you for being here.
Thanks so much, Avijit. I really appreciate it.
How would you introduce yourself to your friends when people ask you, what do you do? What do you tell them?
Well, you're right. Digital anthropologist doesn't really quite roll, naturally. So I always say it's just a fancy way of saying that I study how people make sense of the digital tools in their everyday lives. So it's by talking to them, witnessing how they use them, because people, by the way, are chronic liars, and not because they're bad, but because oftentimes people have perceptions about who they are, what they're supposed to do. And there's a lot of norms, there's a lot of noise in interpreting, how people make sense of these tools. And this is so fundamental, right? So it really helps to just say that I look at this by talking to people, by observing them, and by even playing and doing these kinds of experiments with them. So we can really reveal the contradictions of human nature through these everyday engagements, right?
Give me an example of one of these contradictions that you discovered.
Well, let me take this example that you already brought up about the medical devices, right? A couple of years ago, I was invited by a company which had come up with the supposedly best diagnostic software in the world. And they created it in a lab in Michigan and said, you know what, we've compared it to the best doctors everywhere, and the diagnosis is better than anybody else. So actually, if you enter the symptoms, it will process it and give you the probability, which is excellent. And then it can suggest to the patient what kind of drugs or treatments they should get. Sounds ideal, particularly because we're talking about some chronic issues about majority of people live in areas where they don't have access to quality doctors. So typically a pharmacist operates as a doctor. So where we were is in Uttarakhand. So we did this sort of piloting there, and many people, majority of the women, for example, were chewing tobacco but told me they didn't chew tobacco, as part of the symptoms. So they're like, okay, they don't, of course, smoke. Nobody smokes. Nobody drinks. It was a very, obvious lie. And that's also partly because women are not supposed to be drinkers, smokers, or chewing tobacco, right? But this kind of falsity actually creates false recommendations and can be really dangerous to the outcomes, right? So we have to understand what are the sensitive points in terms of user interfacing, right? Of where do they feel uncomfortable? And that becomes about the matter of culture. Culture is very difficult to, shall we say, flatten into code, right? But there are some things like, oh, I have shortness of breath. That's not a problem. Or, I have a stomach ache or backache. That's not a problem. People have honest way of speaking about that. So I think by understanding even a small group of people and how they work with technologies and where the points where cultural tensions prevail and where is it, where it is very normative, where it's not going to be high risk based on any cultural context, we can build very tailor-made tools to fit different populations, but also see what can scale. And all this doesn't require massive amounts of data. It requires deep engagement with a small but diverse group of people.
This is very similar to what I wrote in a blog post some time back that, I wish human resources people would study more of anthropology and less of, the stuff that is taught in the typical MBA programs, because that's really what HR is supposed to be doing. Unfortunately, it has lost that entire skill because we don't teach anthropology, when it comes to human resources. One great application, as I see, people will, get biased by what they're supposed to say. So, for example, and, I work in the area of learning and development. One of the big problems is learning is supposed to be really boring because if it is, painful, that means it's really good stuff, and that we have to really remove all kinds of entertainment because the workplace is not for fun. It's meant to do serious stuff, and that's something that kills learning and development altogether, which is why it doesn't work in so many places. And I've seen when you work and turn it into play, it becomes so much more powerful. Have you found something similar in your work?
Absolutely. I mean, look, people do not engage with tools because it's utility driven, right? Because yes, we typically have this very top-down model, like very parental, right? So the states, technology companies, when they are, pushed by the state, look at populations, particularly in the global south, in very paternalistic terms. So they're like, oh, how can they use this to get jobs, learn English, learn about healthcare? And that's not how people get on tools or stay on tools, right? It's usually about sexuality, intimacy, entertainment, gaming. These are the number one kind of priorities. And so, what's interesting is that I was doing this work about 2 decades ago in multiple places from Kupam in India to parts of South Africa, in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. And we were in favelas. We went to very difficult terrains, me and my team. And what we noticed is that people always thought, well, if they're poor, then, it was the first let them, it's a pyramid scheme, right? Like that they first need to make it the Maslow pyramid, right? Not the pyramid scheme as such, but actually the Maslow pyramid, right? Where they have to cater to the basics of food, clothing, shelter, and only then self-actualization. But when you go into the field, you realize that the pyramid is upside down because what motivates them to get a mobile phone, say, for example, if you're a Bangladeshi working in the UAE, is to be in touch with your loved ones because, you're working
Absolutely.
10 to 14 hours and you're a number. And then you come home, which is basically bunk beds, 8 of them in one room, and you completely dehumanized. The mobile phone is the only reminder for them that they are somebody. And through humor, through jokes, through the everyday, what we would categorize as mundane and inessential, is actually crucial for them to cope, right? And so we have numerous stories like that of how critical these tools become as coping mechanisms. And once you have that stamina to move on from day to day, you build aspiration, which means you get curious about how to learn about banking maybe because oh, there's this TikTok influencers talking about some basic steps about banking, and I've always couldn't figure out how to move from X to Y, right? And so you start to immerse in these spaces of leisure and it becomes labor, but like you say, in a very productive way. And so those are some of the pathways. In the end, it's like which gate is open and which gate do people actually enter into, right? So I think the ones people enter into are infused with curiosity, creativity, so they can cultivate who they can be versus the door that's open, which is you should do this, you should do that, smells too parenty. So, people don't react very well. They'll go to the opposite door.
And you're so right that it's leisure, play, social connections. This is really where you hook people. These are what create pull. Why don't organizations understand this? Because this is exactly the mistake I see organizations doing. Everything is top down. You better do it or else. Everything is that. Especially when I see organizations handling the challenge of upskilling, they are doing exactly this, that if you don't do it, somebody who knows AI is going to replace you. So it's fear, which is, they think it is going to get people to be upskilled faster. That's a great strategy. It isn't. What do you advise an organization to do instead? How can they leverage your insight in their policies?
So, I think we need to at least acknowledge that what is play is really, shifting the rules of the game. No organization wants the rules of the game to be shifted by anybody. I think that's so. Organizations by nature are risk averse. Even the most entrepreneurial want to have control because the ones who shift the rules of the game should be them and not us. So it's not that organizations don't do it, it's who can do it and who doesn't do it. I'll give you some examples, right? So, for example, from why do they not do it? I was giving a leadership talk for an internal telecom company in Latin America. And I remember asking, how many of you do not watch porn? And they all suddenly got up and they're like, oh my God, we're just now paying attention. And they started laughing because I know they were tuning out because it was a long day. And I was just making a point that we know today, based on metadata, that majority of the internet is fueled by pornography, whether you like it or not. That's a fact, right? And in fact, the countries that are most conservative are the most active. They
Mm.
will do, the more you shun something, the more they want it, right? So after the talk, they all almost were raising their hand and then they put it down. So nobody raised their hands. And then many of them came back after the talk and said, "Oh, you definitely woke me up." And they're like, "Look, actually, if we actually showed, because we could see that much of our data was used for, were pivoted to porn sites. But if we revealed that, a lot of these policymakers in the Latin American region would shut us down." So it's the biggest elephant in the room. We can't talk about it. So you talk about the next thing, which is banking or other kinds of stuff, because it's too risky. So it's basically everybody knows it's an open secret, but let's go to the next bulk of it, which is say a fraction of it, right? So that's one, is the fear of morality, because we no one wants to endorse sexual content consumption. That's one. We are prudes, basically, right? And I'm not saying all porn is great, but I'm talking about that we are human beings who have basic human desires, which is about, intimacy and pleasure, and sex and sexuality are very fundamental to who we are. To pathologize it is basically saying that that's not going to, is basically turning a problem on its head. So that's one. The other is, I think there's this double standard, and I see that a lot. I work with a lot of tech companies in California, and I also circulate a lot around the global south. And one of the actually a classic conversation was this guy who worked in Silicon Valley for many years, and he was in San Jose, and then he moved to Bangalore because his parents were getting older. And he said, I'm the same guy who was giving them advice and they always listened to me. But the moment I landed up in Bangalore, they thought I was like an outsourced worker and they treated me as such. My weight became less. And it wasn't about who I was. And I think there's this double standard of who can play, and it's usually those who are closer to the portals of power. And the further you go, the less you can play. So you follow the rules. You continue. They still have the mindset of the back offices, So even today, which is so crucial, we have India, which is leading in terms of population and data. They've come online and they have enormous energy towards AI adoption and application, far less in the US, by the way, in Europe, because there is based on an aging population, which basically, cognitively makes sense, right? If you're young, you will play with these tools, right? So you technically, as an organization, you should go where young people are, because you will get much more playfulness, which means it'll reveal the potential of these tools. But what they feel is that no, these are in the global south, so these are beneficiaries of our technology. Let's tell them what we have learned from our population. And that doesn't work, because we know in the next few years, it's sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which have the biggest number of young people, the next billion users, and they are going to be shifting, and they already are shifting the ways in which AI is going to be meaningful for our generations to come. So we need to pay attention, because they will be left out if they don't. It's not even an altruistic act, by the way. You can say that, okay, I'm not going to look at them, then you're shooting yourself in your foot, really. It's a high risk not to look at what's happening in the global south now.
And I think a lot of it comes from that very paternalistic view of, we design the good stuff, we can give you some of the leftovers, kind of a mindset, which drives so many people. And, one is sort of seeing that so often. I was particularly struck by one of the statements in your book, which I will refer to. When I read a book, I always say that, is there a sentence that I would keep in my mind as a quote, which will remind me of what the book is all about? And in your book, I actually found that sentence to be that pessimism is a privilege. And I just absolutely loved that. It was so deeply insightful. And it's suddenly, it summarizes the full book. So I kind of thought that if I were your editor, I would have said, put that as the title of the book. But I would love to know what made you say that.
It's funny you said that. I wanted that as a title. I wanted to call it Pessimism Privilege, and or the privilege of pessimism was going to be the title. But this is a political time where, particularly releasing it in the US, the word privilege triggered politics of the left and the right. And suddenly it became all about identity politics. And it wasn't how I was construing it to be. So it was an unfortunate timing issue. So that's why we didn't get to use the word privilege. It's interesting, right? How it gets usurped by the geopolitical moment of time. But, absolutely the behind this whole pessimism as privilege is really underlining the fact that I keep going to particularly like European and American conferences and events, trying to influence stakeholders. And it's always that, well, no, we need the act of refusal, resistance. This is becoming a huge thing, as if it's the way to go in handling AI, right? The most courageous, the most optimistic thing you can do is resist AI, refuse it, and thereby relegate it to a very small place. Instead, what they advocating for is grassroots tools, alternative tech, and here's the thing. It's like when I go to these kinds of spaces that they're so engrossed in these conversations, I ask them all today, how many of you do not use Google, Facebook, basically any Meta tools, the usual suspects, the first five, okay? How
Hmm.
many of you do not? And nobody can raise their hands. So the
Hmm.
problem is that there's a serious lack of honesty, in this conversation, because what we're saying is that we somehow have built this resilience to use Zoom and Teams, and we can complain to our Twitter followers, ex followers, about how horrible big tech is, but the rest of the world should really change course, because they are going to actually be the future, and they need to come up with alternative tech, right? We put the burden onto their shoulders, and not only that, we are like a church. We create guilt, basically. So when they use it, in immediately what we've done is infused a sense of guilt, which means it pulls them down and they are unable to have the energy to play with it. In fact, I'll tell you a little quote story. I was talking at the what do you call it, at a theater festival in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, and I was giving my talk from pessimism to promise, and this artist came up to me and said, I really resonated because I basically was feeling really guilty every time I used generative AI tools because I was thinking, oh my God, there goes the climate, there goes the, I'm like, I'm a bad person for using it to explore it. I should be very practical about it. And I should know what I need to know before I use it. And at some point, he said, I just stopped thinking that and I felt this enormous amounts of freedom, and then I became light and I was able to really like get all these ideas with Gen AI. So and that to me doesn't negate the fact that we have some serious concerns about generative AI usage of energy and water and other kinds
Yeah.
of resources, but it also really emphasizes that for us to really play with tools, we need to have the freedom of lightness. And lightness comes from, the unburdening of don't put it on the users, who are in the immediate time need to do what they do because it is very liberating. It is freedom inducing. But what we need to do is put it back on the technologists and put it back on policymakers to push them to build much more energy efficient tools, sustainable tools, in parallel with these freedom enhancing measures, right? So it's a different kind of conversation we need to have, right?
Somebody who watches the Saas Bahu serial, in India, they say there's this family dramas which are completely, over the top kind of thing. We look down on somebody who accepts that they watch that, whereas somebody watching National Geographic, we would say, that's a very good thing. You are a great person. So there is always this, and you find that in many places, even inside organizations. So, when I was working in an organization, I asked the people, why do you need to study and upskill yourself? What's the reason? So they said initially all this stuff, that, oh, learning is very important. It's the goddess of knowledge that we should never, discard. Saraswati hamare liye hai. And then I said, but do you when you look around in the workplace, do you really see that happening with everybody? And they said yes. And then after 2 3 minutes, this person stops and says, "Hold on, actually, you got a point. I've never ever seen the senior leaders attend a workshop ever in my working life. It's always the juniors who are supposed to do this, who are supposed to do that. And so, if it is that good, and if they can become whatever, vice president or senior vice president without attending any classes, why am I supposed to prove myself by attending a class and then only getting a promotion? And that was for me a huge moment of insight as to how we should be really thinking about, how we position learning, etc. But do you think technology is an equalizer?
Like saying, is a light bulb good, right? I mean, that was the kind of question when electricity came out, right? And imagine a movement today, electricity for good, right? People are like, what the hell are you talking about? And
Yeah,
yet we
yeah.
seem to not, no, but this is a question. Like every new technology of the time has had the same kinds of questions. Is radio going to kill, kill our listening abilities, right? And television was going to create zombies out of families. I mean, if you look at the mainstream headlines, right? In fact, books were supposed to ruin our intelligence because the way we measured intellect was through memorization. So when books came about, people thought, what's going to happen to our oral cultures, right? So the way I look at it is that, of course, every technology is a mirror of human imagination, and we have the capacity to being extraordinarily ingenious and really fruitful and productive for the well-being of our species and also outside of our species. But also we have the most pathological, most deviant and harmful characters, and we fill the full spectrum because that's what human nature is. So what we can do is that we can understand that this is human nature, which means that we need to stress test all technologies to the basest point, which will go to that point, right? And then try to see how much can we mitigate. We need to focus on as much mitigation but and as much enhancing of human freedoms for expression, for creativity, and for well-being of each other. And I think this sort of balance has to happen together. Otherwise, for example, what would happen is lazy innovation to fix a problem like locked profiles, right? We know that much of hate speech, is misogynistic speech, and a lot of activity online can be very devastating to particularly half the world's population. So
Yes.
what did tech companies just come up with is locked profiles, which are really, if you think about it, is basically saying, oh, do you feel unsafe in a public space? What I recommend is you stay at home and lock the door and you'll be completely safe. And so, yes, you would. Then you might as well go move to Afghanistan, isn't it? So, I mean, that's actually an endorsed policy there. They stay at home and not do anything else. So, I think we cannot think about risk. And that's something, especially living in Europe, they are so focused on risk without simultaneously talking about freedoms. So they're like all about consent, all about cookies. And then look what happened to, just because I consent doesn't mean that I'm actually, getting
Consenting.
my full choice. Exactly. Consent is only meaningful when there's legitimate choice. And oftentimes we don't have legitimate choice. So, yeah, so I think that is one of the biggest issues I find, uh, across board, across stakeholders to not see them in tandem.
Yeah, this is the whole notion of false choice. When you look at the end user licensing agreement, which is like, 70 pages long with all kinds of stuff, which, and nobody ever, ever, ever reads it, including perhaps the lawyers who have to say yes if they want to log onto the machine or to use that particular thing. It's an absolute, false choice which is being given. But that's
Yes,
how
and it's
it
by the way,
works.
it's designed for not being read.
Yes.
It's not a coincidence. No, it was not meant to be read. And we also know the stats by now that less than 1% actually attempts to read it. Not even like reads it, attempts to read it. And so I think part of it is that terms and conditions is a nice symbolic way of saying that when you go for self-regulation, this is what happens, because it's a lazy way to protect yourself and show signal that you're doing something, but it's not actually meaningful.
But on the other hand, the criticism against the European Union has been that they are so conservative that it stifles innovation because there are so many regulations. You first build the technology, we'll then figure out regulation. Is that the right approach to do it, or is Europe doing it right? And the others need to learn
Yeah,
from
so
it.
no, you're right. By the way, so you're right that you have the European model and you have the American model. American model is like, the whole move fast,
Move
break
fast
things.
and
It's
break
still
things.
exactly. It's the same logic, right? So which is what OpenAI did, and it wasn't a surprise they got lawsuits. It was factored into it. I mean, they must have known that there would be lawsuits, and that cost comes into the whole venture capital package, right? But it's a way of proof of concept. Because look, once a technology is only meaningful once you release it into the wild. The wild is us, human beings, because no company, no organization can possibly foresee the enormous amounts of human ingenuity and creativity around the world. And that's a good thing, by the way. There's no such thing as a complete technology. All technologies are in the becoming. So, that being said, so I agree with the mindset of the American, like release a tool not as a complete because there's no such thing. And we need to understand its purpose for some time because people have to play with it and apply it and they make meaning out of it. And that's when it becomes something, right? And that's where business models get developed. But where the European mindset comes is that we put people at the center. The way they go about it may not be great, but they are people centered, not as a consumer, but as a citizen. And that's where an ideological shift is taking place, where they're moving in different directions because they look at how citizens are protected. What does their data mean? Like Denmark releasing one of the first, rights for citizens over their own facial data, right?
Yeah.
So that makes sense because they're seeing people as, citizens with rights, right? Whereas Americans see them as pure consumers and not as, those with rights. So it's just two different. But then between these two models, you have the rest of the world who's experimenting with many different versions, who doesn't have the privilege of, say, copyright. Most parts of the world, copyright has never really been a thing. It's like it's been piracy, like majority of the models. Nobody actually
Yeah.
seriously has built a business model around copyright because it's been happening. So if you want to see the future of, say, streaming, you should look at Angami and other kinds of Middle East companies where they recognize that you need to give immediate value add, you need to build meaningful engagements, relationships with these technologies that people want to pay because you can't enforce copyright anyway. And that's
Yeah.
the norm, right? Whereas we are still looking at, the US, the small elite creators who can actually block AI and demand, certain kinds of things. But these are already the people who already benefit from these systems and are of minority and elite in the creative sector. So, and that's again not scalable. Right? Actually, much of what the US does is not scalable. The enormous amounts of resources they need, which is basically throwing enormous amounts of money, which creates inefficiencies in innovation, nobody should be scaling that, right? The way in which they basically move into ownership, proprietary nature, patenting. It's not the way to go about, especially when it comes to, the climate crisis, about healthcare crisis. Much of what matters to our well-being doesn't really follow the American model. So, I think we need to think outside of the usual suspects of the European model and the American model and look at how people, which is the majority world, 90% of young people in the global south, 85% of the world's population is in the global south. So let's look at them and see how they dealing with it. And let's learn from all kinds of experiments from a granular level, from the, municipality to, all the way up to the national and even transnational, like South-South cooperation, because there are answers there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
And in many places, if you look at, you give the technology and watch how people use it to solve their day-to-day problems, you get tremendous insight about, the usage. And I remember when, in the early days of Twitter, not X, but Twitter, one of the Danish municipalities actually used Twitter. They created the municipal department, found that logging it on Twitter was an easy way they could allocate people, and you had the geolocation, and they could say that, well, this my street light is not working, and the person would go and solve it, and then they would say thank you, and so that means the ticket is closed. So they removed the ticket system, kept it entirely online, and those were some of the ways in which it was being done. um, I would like to go back to something that you said earlier, that the way we very often use this technology is we have you've used the term digital sanitation workers in some sense. That the cleanup, digital labor is hugely, hugely manual, but the manual labor is being done somewhere else in the poorer countries. So all the content moderation and everything that you are talking about, those harmful things, it's not happening in the place where the technology has been developed. So, you know, you do the killing in a different place, and you bring in the packaged meat for consumption in a different place. So I think that's really the model that we are seeing. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I mean, so look, there's absolutely it's a very labor intensive, but it's very invisibilized because people, is particularly companies, will get more venture capital money based on whether they can promise automation, whether they can promise replacement, because you have to show the bottom line. So if you speak in hardcore terms of automation and replacement, you will get the money. But in reality, a lot of it is human moderated because culture is difficult to compute. So what is harmful in different contexts, what is inappropriate in different contexts, matters. And also, it matters in terms of timing. Like I mentioned, the word privilege. 15 years ago, it wouldn't have really mattered. Today, it is a political thing. 15 years later, I don't know. It may mean something different, right? And then when we think about the different kinds of, languages and dialects and the way in which we speak, teenagers can be very public but have a very different lingo where we have no clue what they're saying and they're very visible. So I think, how do you then moderate that which you do not understand? Right? So it requires, and of course, we're using AI now to a high degree of even moderating, annotating, but it's people, again, there's a lot of speculation that this can happen very easily, but what's happening is a lot of AI slop, a lot of, a poor understanding of language models, particularly because they don't put enough weight on culture. In fact, you can see studies upon studies showing that much of the LLMs out there are basically built on the cultures of like basically American, or maybe even a little bit of European values. And that doesn't really translate or compute with the fact that majority of users are not in these contexts. So there's a complete disconnection, and that will result in, shutting off the internet, some really extreme measures. So what and we see that, right? Internet shutdowns are happening more and more frequently. Governments are getting more and more angry, annoyed, because what we're doing is we leaving them with some black and white choices of very draconian laws or draconian acts because you don't have any in between, that you give them for allowing for sovereignty, dignity, right? And I'm not like excusing, say, dictator style shutting down of the internet, but I'm talking about the everyday government that is trying to, do their best, but feel like it's out of their control. And this is the only thing is they have this kill switch.
What are three myths about the future of work in Asia or Africa? What are some of the things that are very different, which we don't acknowledge or take into account?
One, that it's going to be all automated. Absolutely not true. In fact, if anything, it puts value into our services, our relations of care. We need healthcare, we need tactility. Second is that people have to play with tools and they can't be instrumental about it. They can't be utility driven about it. And third is that, the young people are the future because they see these tools as possibilities of becoming. And that is a fact. And so, if you want to see where these tools are headed, you need to get off your ass and move to the global south.